in the midst of one of the harshest winters known to the frozen lands of northern Canada. When the biting wind carves icy sculptures into the barren trees and the dense, unyielding snow blankets every surface, fate weaves a tale of survival and darkness. It is a time when the familiar landscapes of the Arctic, usually ruled by the stoic majesty of the polar bear, begin to shift and warp. The usual expanse of crystalline ice and endless tundra has retreated, leaving behind a treacherous, ever-changing terrain of snow-dusted forests and jagged ice outcroppings. Here, in this fragmented wilderness on the outskirts of civilization, the eternal struggle for life takes on a new, harrowing dimension. A small group of seasoned hunters had ventured into these northern reaches seeking game and the promise of a fruitful season. They were men and women whose lives were intertwined with the rhythm of the wild, the biting cold, the deep silence of the snow-covered woods, and the ever-watchful gaze of creatures that had thrived in these unforgiving climes for millennia. However, nature is as unpredictable as it is relentless. Without warning, a sudden, cataclysmic snowstorm descended upon them, a white fury that blotted out the familiar, disoriented their senses, and left them stranded in the heart of a landscape that had transformed into a labyrinth of ice and darkness. The storm raged with a ferocity that seemed almost supernatural, its howling winds bending ancient pines, swirling snow into dizzying spirals, and obscuring all signs of shelter. The hunters huddled together in what remained of an old, weather-beaten cabin, a fragile refuge against the unyielding cold. For days, the tempest bore down on them, and as the food supplies dwindled and hope ebbed away like distant memories, the true terror of isolation began to seep into their hearts. It was in that oppressive darkness, with only the ceaseless sound of the wind and the distant creaks of shifting ice for company, that whispers of old legends resurfaced, whispers that spoke of a creature so entwined with the land of eternal winter that its name alone was enough to curdle blood. According to the ancient lore of the indigenous peoples, stories passed down among the Algonquin, Cree, and Ojibwe, the Wendigo is not merely a monster of the cold but the embodiment of a curse, a manifestation of unchecked greed, insatiable hunger, and the descent into madness. Some accounts describe it as a gaunt, emaciated figure with skin clinging tightly to its bones, its eyes sunken and its teeth sharp enough to shred through flesh, evoking an image of a living, breathing nightmare. Other legends portray the Wendigo as a more monstrous hybrid, a half-human, half-beast entity with features reminiscent of a great, twisted stag, crowned with antlers and draped in tattered, dark fur. Despite the variations in its appearance, the core of the legend remains the same. The Wendigo is a creature of eternal hunger, cursed to roam the desolate, frozen wilds in search of flesh, a harbinger of doom that preys upon the desperate and the weak. As the relentless storm finally began to ease, the battered hunters emerged from the shelter into a transformed world. The once familiar outlines of the forest had faded into a monochrome landscape, where every sound was swallowed by the echo of the wind and every shadow seemed to conceal untold horror. Amid this desolation, the polar bear, nature's colossal hunter and king of the ice, began its long, uncertain journey inland. Driven by hunger, it had been forced away from its usual domain of drifting ice and abundant seals. Now, in the unfamiliar terrain of dense, snow-laden forest, the bear moved with both caution and a primal determination to find a meal. The polar bear's presence in this rugged forest was itself a stark anomaly, a titan of the frozen north thrust into a landscape where its mastery of ice and solitude was challenged by the encroaching wild. Its enormous paws, normally graceful on slick ice, now left deep, uneven prints in the soft, treacherous snow. With each laborious step, its keen senses were alert to the slightest disturbance, a rustle among the trees, the faintest whisper of movement, any sign that prey might be nearby. Despite its might, the bear was in a state of vulnerability, its natural domain transformed by the storm into an unpredictable, shadowy maze. It was during one of these quiet, desperate moments that a new terror began to manifest, a terror born not of flesh and bone, but of myth and old, haunted lore. As the polar bear ambled through the darkened forest edge, a series of faint, otherworldly sounds floated on the chilly air. At first, these sounds were nearly imperceptible, a low moan here, a faint, discordant cry there, barely more than a trick of the wind. But to those who had heard the ancient stories, they were unmistakable, the eerie, haunting calls of the Wendigo. Shrouded by the dense silhouettes of frost-covered pines and the diffused glow of a weak, overcast sky, the Wendigo was said to wander these very woods. Legends held that it moved with a supernatural grace, its footsteps silent upon the snowy ground, while its unearthly wails, half human, half beast, sent shivers of terror down the spine of anyone who dared listen. Its form, though debated in the whispers of tradition, was often imagined as gaunt and towering, a figure whose very presence evoked the insatiable, cursed hunger of a soul long lost to despair. On that fateful day, as the polar bear pressed deeper into the forest, the atmosphere around it shifted. The biting cold gave way to an even deeper, more oppressive chill, a cold that seemed to emanate not merely from the ice but from something far more sinister lurking in the shadows. The bear paused, its nostrils flaring, as it sensed that it was no longer alone. There was a subtle change in the air, a heaviness, as though the forest itself was bracing for the arrival of a specter. The silence, which had been omnipresent since the storm, deepened into an almost tangible pressure. In this moment, the hunters, recovering from their ordeal in the ruined cabin, also began to sense that the wilderness was no longer a simple, unchanging expanse. Their eyes, red and puffy from fear and frost, caught fleeting glimpses of movement between the towering trees. Shadows danced unnaturally, and the wind carried with it not just the scent of decay, but whispers that seemed to speak of ancient tragedies and unhealed wounds. Uncertain and terrified, they spoke in hushed, trembling voices of the Wendigo, a name that now carried a weight of dread, a specter that could not be ignored. As twilight descended on the battered landscape, a profound stillness settled over the forest, a stillness that felt as if it belonged to another realm altogether. The polar bear, continuing its relentless trek in search of sustenance, sensed that this was the moment when the old legends might come to life. In the gathering gloom, amid a tangle of snow and shadow, figures began to emerge from the darkness. The first was not seen directly, but rather its presence was signaled by the ghostly echo of a cry, a sound that was both mournful and terrifying. A cry that resonated in the empty spaces between the trees. It was the Wendigo, coming to claim the territory and, by ancient custom, the soul of any creature that dared intrude upon its domain. The air grew colder still as the Wendigo stepped forward into the dim light. Its form was indistinct at first, a shifting, spectral mass that seemed to merge with the shadows, but gradually, distinct features emerged, tall and gaunt, with limbs that appeared unnaturally elongated. The creature moved with a grace that was both eerie and predatory. Its skin was pallid and stretched tight over a framework of bone, its eyes, deep and hollow, burned with an otherworldly fire that could unnerve even the most hardened soul. In some whispered versions of the legend, the Wendigo bore the semblance of a man long corrupted by an unquenchable hunger, its features twisted and deformed by the curse that had overtaken it. In others, it was a monstrous fusion of man and beast, a hybrid entity whose very existence defied the natural order. A living embodiment of the eternal, all-consuming hunger of the wild. At that moment, the polar bear and the Wendigo stood mere paces apart on a narrow, frost-covered ridge at the edge of the forest. The bear's enormous form, once the uncontested ruler of the endless ice, now faced an enemy of legend, a creature that was as much a part of ancient lore as it was an expression of nature's darker impulses. The polar bear's breath formed large, visible clouds in the frigid air, and its eyes, dark and unyielding, assessed the foe before it. For the bear, this encounter was unprecedented, a confrontation with a terror born of myth rather than flesh and bone. Yet, the primal instinct to survive and the unyielding drive to assert dominance over one's territory were as much a part of its being as the icy winds that whipped around it. Thus, as the last light of day faded into the oppressive darkness of the northern night, the stage was set for a battle that would defy expectation, a clash where raw physical power met spectral, supernatural might. The polar bear, steeled by generations of survival on the unforgiving ice, prepared to confront the Wendigo with all the force of its evolutionary might. The Wendigo, a silent, ghostly harbinger of ancient curses and eternal hunger, moved with a purposeful stealth that belied its fearsome reputation. Both were symbols of extremes. 1. A tangible force of nature forged in the relentless cold of the Arctic, the other. A creature of myth that haunted the deepest recesses of human fear. A being born of desperation and transformed by the dark rituals of survival. As the polar bear lifted its massive head, letting out a low, resonant growl that rolled across the frozen expanse, the Wendigo's eyes seemed to gleam with a malevolent light. The quiet wilderness around them held its breath, as if the very soul of the land awaited the outcome of this fateful meeting. In that charged silence, the collision of two worlds was imminent. A confrontation that would not only test the limits of physical strength but also the tenuous boundary between myth and reality. In the days following the harrowing night that saw a desperate act, an act that had forever altered the lives of those trapped in the storm, the survivors found themselves plunged into a new reality. Outside, the bitter wind still howled ceaselessly through the snow-laden pines, and the once familiar landscape of the forest had taken on an otherworldly quality. The brilliant whiteness of the snow now appeared marred by deep shadows and strange, shifting patterns, as if the very earth was under the influence of a malevolent force. Within the frail walls of their dilapidated cabin, a heavy silence reigned. The survivors, their faces gaunt from days of cold and starvation, could no longer escape the memory of that fateful night. Each of them carried the weight of the decision that had been forced upon them. A decision that had violated the deepest recesses of their humanity. In hushed whispers, they recounted the terrible moment when one among them, driven by an unendurable hunger and despair, had consumed the flesh of a fallen friend. Now, that act of cannibalism had become a spark that ignited an ancient curse. The dark myth of the Wendigo. At first, it was only subtle changes that unsettled the group. The man who had committed the unthinkable, once a quiet, resourceful hunter, now seemed to wear a mask of torment. His skin, once vibrant and full of life even in the harsh conditions, had taken on a pallid, ashen tone. His eyes, once warm and curious, were now sunken and flickered with a strange, unyielding hunger. His movements, once deliberate and measured, had become jittery and erratic, as if he were no longer fully in control of his own body. Though he tried to hide it, a deep, unsettling change had begun to manifest, one that went beyond the physical and seeped into the very essence of his soul. As the survivors began their tenuous attempts to repair their damaged situation, a pervasive sense of dread settled over them. They could no longer dismiss the ominous signs and the whispered legends of old that now haunted them. The wind, which had earlier offered only a bitter taste of winter's chill, now carried with it something more sinister, the faint echoes of lamenting wails and the distant, mournful murmur of voices that did not belong to the living. At times, in the quiet moments between fits of anxious conversation, one could almost hear the sound of footsteps crunching on fresh snow where no man had walked, or a guttural cry that sent shivers down the spine. In the light of the following day, the survivors cautiously ventured out beyond the small confines of the cabin. The forest appeared transformed, no longer the serene, albeit harsh, sanctuary they had known, but a place imbued with latent, foreboding energies. The towering pines, heavy with frost, loomed like ancient guardians, their branches whispering warnings of approaching doom. The snow beneath their boots was uneven, marked by deep prints that hinted at unseen creatures stalking the wilderness. Each step taken was accompanied by the constant awareness that they were not alone, that somewhere in the enveloping cold, a presence both sinister and inexplicable lurked in wait. During one of these outward treks, a young hunter, still trembling from the memories of that cursed night, paused on a ridge overlooking a valley blanketed in pristine white. His eyes, wide with both fear and determination, fixated on a series of gigantic, irregular footprints embedded in the soft snow. The prints were unlike those left by any animal he had ever encountered. They were enormous and seemed to belong to something that defied the natural order, a creature born of myth. Overwhelmed by a sudden surge of dread, he rushed back to the group, his voice breaking as he described the terrifying discovery. In the oppressive atmosphere, every whispered conversation confirmed the worst fears. The curse was no longer confined to a single man. It had become a malignant, pervasive presence within the forest, as if it were awakening to claim its due. As twilight descended once more over the desolate landscape, The interplay of amber and violet hues on the horizon did little to alleviate the encroaching darkness in the hearts of the survivors. They settled in a somber circle near the feeble light of a dying fire, its flame barely flickering against the vast shadow of the surrounding trees. In that fragile moment of gathering, the group's collective memory seemed to converge on that terrifying event, the act of cannibalism that had unleashed a curse, the transformation that had begun, and the unshakable feeling that something was now hunting them. Their voices trembled as they recounted the horrors, each detail more macabre than the last, until the air itself seemed to thicken with sorrow and impending doom. It was during one such night, when the wind's mournful song mingled with the soft hissing of the cold, that a sudden shift in the atmosphere confirmed their worst suspicions. The night was especially dark, the new moon casting the landscape into utter inky blackness, punctuated only by the occasional glimmer of starlight. In that consuming darkness, the survivors heard a sound, a low, resonant moan that seemed to arise from the very depths of the forest. It was not the sound of wind or of any ordinary animal, it was something else entirely. A sound imbued with an almost preternatural quality that sent shivers down every spine. In a panic-stricken hush, the survivors listened as the moaning grew steadily louder, as if something was drawing near. They huddled together, hearts pounding in terror, waiting with bated breath for the inevitable revelation of the cursed presence. The trees appeared to lean in closer, their skeletal branches clawing at the dark sky, and the snow, previously pristine and silent, now bore the faint imprints of heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to echo with every heartbeat. It was then that the first unmistakable sign of the Wendigo manifested, a fleeting glimpse of a gaunt, elongated silhouette moving with unnatural grace among the shadows. Its form, barely perceptible at first, grew clearer with each passing second, a figure with limbs that seemed too long, a face etched with sorrow and ferocity, and eyes that burned with an otherworldly hunger. The sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying, a stark embodiment of the ancient legends that had haunted the survivors since that cursed night. The Wendigo was not merely a physical predator, it was a living curse. A manifestation of the insatiable greed and endless hunger that had been born from the darkest depths of human desperation. In that moment, as its spectral form passed silently between the trees, the survivors felt the full weight of the myth come crashing into their reality. The cursed transformation had not been an isolated event, its influence had seeped into the heart of the forest, altering the very fabric of their existence. In the ensuing hours, the group's fear transformed into frantic action. Every rustle in the underbrush was now a potential harbinger of doom. Every glimpse of movement a reminder that the Wendigo could strike at any moment. Paranoia took root. Every survivor became hyper-alert, their conversations reduced to whispers and their eyes constantly scanning the dim wilderness. The once shared hope of rescue or escape began to dwindle, replaced by a desperate need to understand and, if possible, counter the malignant force that now haunted their every step. With the rising intensity of their terror, the survivors also grappled with the moral weight of their actions. The memory of the cannibalistic act, once a desperate, unthinkable choice made in the crucible of starvation, now loomed over them like a specter. Guilt and shame mingled with fear, forging a palpable sense of doom that clouded their every thought. They questioned whether the curse of the Wendigo was not only a supernatural punishment for their transgression, but also a reflection of the darkness that lay hidden within every human heart. It was as if the forest itself had absorbed their collective sins, manifesting in the twisted form of the Wendigo, a relentless reminder that in the pursuit of survival, one might pay the ultimate price in both body and soul. As the night deepened further, the survivors eventually resolved that staying in the cabin was no longer an option. The oppressive atmosphere, charged with the palpable presence of the curse, made the shelter feel more like a prison than a haven. With hearts heavy and spirits teetering on the edge of despair, they made a fateful decision: to abandon the cabin and attempt a perilous journey through the unforgiving wilderness in search of a distant safe haven. A small indigenous village rumored to be hidden deep in the northern woods, where age-old traditions might offer protection against such malevolent forces. Under the cloak of midnight, the survivors gathered their meager belongings, tattered coats, a few precious supplies, and the remnants of hope. The forest around them was a maze of shadowed paths, its familiar shapes distorted by the darkness and the swirling snow. Every sound was amplified, the crunch of frozen snow underfoot, the distant call of an owl echoing mournfully across the icy expanse, and the occasional, almost imperceptible murmur of something moving among the trees. With a shared, unspoken resolve, they stepped out into the night, each step a gamble against the unknown, each heartbeat a testament to the fragile spark of life that refused to be snuffed out. Even as they began their journey, the sinister influence of the Wendigo could be felt. Out on the open trail, beneath a sky churning with storm clouds, the survivors encountered eerie phenomena that defied rational explanation. At times, a shape would be seen darting between the ancient trees, a fleeting, ghostly figure that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Other times, the wind would carry soft, almost mournful sounds, a distant whisper or a sorrowful sigh, that seemed to speak of lost souls and eternal hunger. These encounters stoked the flames of their fear, fueling a lingering dread that the cursed spirit was not content to remain hidden in the darkness, but would follow, relentless and unyielding, amid the bitter cold and pressing terror. The survivors' internal conflict grew more intense. Each individual wrestled with the weight of their own guilt and the crushing realization that their very act of cannibalism might have unleashed forces they could neither comprehend nor control. In quiet moments, as they huddled around sparse fires, the group would fall into a heavy silence, each lost in thoughts of the monstrous legend that now haunted them. Discussions turned into whispered recitations of old folklore, stories of the Wendigo passed down through generations. Tales of cursed hunters doomed to wander the wilderness with an insatiable, unholy appetite. The line between myth and reality blurred until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Then, in a moment that would etch itself indelibly into their memories, one of the survivors, an older man with deeply lined features and eyes clouded by sorrow, became the first to experience a shocking transformation. As he trudged along the narrow trail that wound its way through the dense forest, his face, once marked by the resilience of countless winters, began to take on an eerie pallor. His skin, stretched thin over angular bone, lost its warmth and vibrancy, appearing almost translucent in the moonlight. His eyes, which had once shone with a calm resolve, grew distant and hollow, as if the life had begun to drain from them. Those close enough to witness it whispered in hushed tones of the curse taking hold, that the dark magic of the Wendigo had begun to infect even those who had not directly committed the unspeakable act. The realization that the transformation might be contagious, that the darkness might be spreading like a malignant force through their ranks, sent shockwaves of terror through the group. Panic mingled with despair as they saw the signs of change, the slow, agonizing shift from human to something other, a gradual erosion of identity into an endless, cursed hunger. The forest around them seemed to darken further, its very essence echoing with the malevolent whispers of the Wendigo. In that desolate, frozen moment, the survivors understood that they were not merely fleeing the physical horror of the storm, but also the moral and supernatural repercussions of their own desperate acts. As the first hints of dawn began to break through the oppressive veil of night, the group pressed onward with a mix of dread and determination. Each step on the rugged, icy path was weighed down by the fear that what they had unleashed might never be contained, a fear that the ancient curse could, with each passing moment, turn them into something as hideous and relentless as the Wendigo itself. Their journey, filled with the stifling chill of winter and the ghostly remnants of their own terror, became a pilgrimage of haunted souls seeking redemption amidst the remnants of a once sacred wilderness. In Part 2, the forest emerges as both a physical and psychological labyrinth, a place where the beauty of nature belies the darkness that lurks in its shadowed recesses. The survivors, forever changed by their ordeal, face an uncertain future as they struggle to reconcile their own humanity with the horrors they have witnessed. As they traverse the icy wilderness, every sound, every flicker of movement in the peripheral edges of their vision, becomes a reminder that the curse of the Wendigo is far from vanquished. And in this relentless, oppressive atmosphere, the line between the natural world and the supernatural grows ever thinner, a blurred horizon where the souls of the lost may yet roam forever, in search of something they can never find. Under a leaden sky where the snow glistens in a pallid, ghostly light, The survivors emerge from the forest with hearts heavy from loss and minds haunted by the deeds of that dreadful night. The storm has abated, yet the atmosphere remains charged with a chill that seeps deeper than the cold, the chill of despair, of guilt, and of an ancient curse that has taken root. Their journey through the frozen wilderness has been a trial by ice and terror. Now, they trudge onward along a narrow, winding trail defined by ice-rimmed trees and broken, creaking logs, each step resonating with memories of how the Wendigo's terrible presence first shattered the remnants of their hope. In the early hours before dawn, the survivors finally catch sight of distant, flickering lights, a small indigenous village rumored to be a place of refuge and ancient wisdom, where the old ways might offer protection against the dark curse that now haunts their souls. As they press forward, the landscape around them seems transformed. The once familiar snowdrifts and frost-kissed pines are now etched with deep gouges and cloven tracks that hint at unseen presences stalking the margins of reality. Every gust of wind carries with it a faint echo, an indistinct, mournful wail that could be mistaken, in moments of terror, for the lament of a doomed spirit. It is as though the very earth has absorbed the sorrow of that cursed night, and its quiet whispers serve as both warning and elegy. The survivors' faces, gaunt and drawn by hunger and fear, are illuminated by the pale glow of early morning as they gather close for warmth around a small, crackling fire. The flames, dancing wearily against the deep blue of the pre-dawn sky, reveal the haunted eyes of those who have narrowly escaped the clutches of despair. They speak in hushed tones of the Wendigo, the spectral monster born of cannibalistic desperation, recounting its first appearance as if it were a shared nightmare. Their voices tremble as they recall the moment when a once familiar comrade transformed into a creature of malediction, his skin paling and his eyes hollowing, until the monstrous visage of the Wendigo was all that remained. Every word is a requiem, every whispered sentence a painful reminder that in the pursuit of survival, the boundaries of humanity can shatter like fragile ice underfoot. As the group finally reaches the outskirts of the village, the survivors experience a brief, bittersweet reprieve from the oppressive wilderness. The indigenous settlement, nestled in a sheltered valley where ancient stone and earth speak of timeless traditions, offers a fragile sanctuary from the horrors of that cursed winter. The villagers, wise in the lore of their forebears, receive the survivors with somber empathy. Their eyes, glistening with both sorrow and understanding, seem to carry the accumulated weight of generations, of tragedies past and lessons hard learned. Around the communal fire in the village center, the survivors gather to share their story once more. They speak slowly, with great care, of the brutal events that led to the birth of the Wendigo curse. Their narrative is punctuated by pauses in which the only sound is the soft crackle of burning wood and the distant, melancholic murmur of winds over the ancient pines. Yet even in the safety of this humble refuge, the psychological scars remain indelible. In the quiet hours, as the villagers drift off to sleep beneath blankets of ancestral wisdom and gentle chants, the survivors lie awake, haunted by dreams of that monstrous night. They relive the terror over and over in fragmented, nightmarish visions, the sound of a blood-curdling scream carried on the wind, the sight of a gaunt form with eyes like dying embers emerging from shadowed trees, the relentless, grinding clash of raw, unyielding nature against the intangible horror of a curse that can consume the soul. The memory of the Wendigo, a specter both horrifying and tragic, becomes an ever-present shadow in their minds. A constant reminder that the desperate choices made in the face of starvation have consequences that echo through time. Over the course of many long, difficult days, the survivors attempt to rebuild what little they can of their lives. They tend to their wounds, both physical and spiritual, and endeavor to reconnect with the rhythms of the natural world, though always with a persistent sense of loss and caution. In the village, elders share tales of the past, legends interwoven with reminders of the inherent darkness lurking within the human heart. They speak of rituals and traditions designed to ward off curses, to honor the balance between light and shadow. Slowly, the survivors begin to find solace in these ancient rites, even as they continue to grapple with the horror of their experience. Yet, despite their efforts, the memory of that cursed winter and the monstrous Wendigo remains a constant presence, an unyielding specter that haunts every whispered conversation and every fearful glance cast into the dark. At times, when the wind shifts and the night deepens, the survivors swear they hear the distant echo of a guttural cry, the sound of a creature that is neither wholly man nor beast, but something else entirely. It is a sound that, even in the safety of the village, raises shivers down their spines and reminds them that the curse may never be truly laid to rest. In the final hours before a tentative new day dawns, the survivors gather one last time at the edge of the village. They stand in silence, looking out over a landscape that is slowly beginning to thaw, where the pristine white of the snow is giving way to the muted browns and greens of the coming spring. The burden of their shared ordeal weighs heavily on them, but there is also a glimmer of resolve, a determination to honor the memories of those lost and to learn from the darkness that had nearly consumed them. In that fragile, quiet moment, it becomes clear that the true legacy of the Wendigo curse is not the horror itself, but the enduring lesson of humanity's capacity for both unimaginable depravity and extraordinary resilience. Thus, as the first rays of morning light break through the horizon, casting a gentle glow over a world still steeped in winter's chill, the survivors begin the long process of recovery. They understand that the path ahead is uncertain and that the scars of that night will never entirely fade, but they also know that within them lies the strength to rebuild, to forge a future beyond the haunted echoes of the past. The lingering presence of the Wendigo, whether a true supernatural curse or a manifestation of their collective nightmares, becomes a cautionary myth, a tale to be passed down to warn future generations of the perilous edge between survival and the loss of one's humanity. In the end, the legend of the lost hunters and the Wendigo is etched into the frozen memory of the land, a somber, eternal reminder of a time when desperation and darkness converged in a winter of endless night. It is a story of horror, of moral compromise in the face of insurmountable odds, and of the enduring, fragile spark of hope that even in the bleakest moments, life can find a way to persevere. And as the survivors slowly reclaim their lives and the village awakens to a new dawn, the whispered tales of the cursed winter continue to echo on the wind, a timeless saga of the darkness that lurks at the edge of our existence. In the aftermath of that fateful winter, as the survivors reach the quiet sanctuary of the indigenous village, the profound silence of the forest seemed to offer both a curse and a chance for redemption. The once fierce winds had dwindled to a gentle murmur as dawn's early light crept over the horizon, softening the frozen scars that the terrible night had etched upon the land. Yet, inside each weary soul still trembling from the ordeal, there remained an indelible echo of loss, a deep-rooted ache that spoke not only of the physical toll of the brutal storm but also of the moral and spiritual darkness that had been unleashed. Over the ensuing days, the survivors came together beneath the sheltering boughs of ancient cedars and pines. Their arrival in the village was marked by solemn rituals, quiet gatherings around communal fires, where the orange glow of burning wood fought against the lingering chill of the long winter. Elders, whose eyes sparkled with the wisdom of countless hardships endured, welcomed the survivors with a mixture of compassion and cautious reverence. They listened intently as the travelers recounted the nightmarish events that had ripped apart their lives, the endless, punishing blizzard, the inescapable hunger that drove a man to commit the unthinkable act, and the horrific transformation that bore the curse of the Wendigo. Under the steady watch of the villagers' traditions, the survivors found themselves forced to confront both the external horror of their isolation and the internal scars of guilt and grief. In one quiet session, beneath the flickering light of a communal fire, the survivors offered their tribulations in hushed voices. Each story was a thread woven into the vast tapestry of human suffering and resilience, a chronicle of how, when stripped bare by the merciless cold and isolation, the boundaries between human decency and primal terror dissolved. They spoke of the moment when the cursed hunter's eyes had dimmed to a lifeless gray, when his skin had taken on the pallor of death, and when that once familiar face was twisted irrevocably into a mask of unending hunger. The villagers, their expressions grave, affirmed the ancient warnings. In the deepest depths of despair and isolation, a human soul might indeed become an instrument of an old, fearsome curse. As days turned into weeks, the survivors began to piece together a fragile semblance of normalcy. They assisted one another in the tedious work of rebuilding, repairing the meager shelter provided by the village, sharing the scant food they had salvaged, and lending their support to those whose emotional wounds were too deep to ignore. Slowly, the villagers led them through time-honored rituals meant to cleanse the spirit and ward off the malevolent forces believed to dwell in the wilderness. Ceremonies involving smudging with sacred herbs and the chanting of ancient songs filled the long winter nights. Each word and scent serving as a desperate appeal to the benevolence of the natural world. Yet even as the physical scars of that cursed winter began to heal, the dark legend of the Wendigo continued to linger in whispered conversations. Children would huddle around elders, wide-eyed and trembling, as tales of the creature, whose eyes burned with the reflection of 1,000 lost souls and whose presence brought a numb terror, were recounted again and again. The survivors, burdened by the memories of their own ordeal, found themselves reinterpreting every rustle of wind and every shifting shadow. Sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, one could almost swear that the distant cry of the forest carried the sound of a mournful wail, a chilling, faint echo of that cursed night. Time moved onward, inexorable as the glaciers that once dominated the barren lands. Yet nothing could entirely erase the legacy of that winter. As spring tentatively emerged from beneath layers of ice and snow, the boundaries between past and present blurred even further. The survivors, now marked forever by what they had experienced, began to rebuild not only their lives but a collective memory that would serve as both warning and remembrance. In communal gatherings, the elders recounted the tale of the lost hunter and the cursed Wendigo, a narrative that was half myth, half confession, and wholly a reminder of the terrible price of desperation. On one particularly clear morning, when the sun shone bright and the ice began to melt into rivulets that sparkled like liquid diamonds, a lone survivor ventured to a hill overlooking the village. From this vantage point, he could see the stark beauty of the land, now stirring with the quiet promise of renewal. Yet, even amid this pastoral scene, his thoughts turned to that endless winter, the howling storms, the desperate acts, and the ghostly figure that had stalked them in the dark. He remembered the terror in the eyes of his comrades, the horrified silence that had followed the cursed act, and the way the Wendigo's presence had seemed to consume every hope. And as he stood there, a poignant realization dawned upon him. The true horror was not in the creature itself, but in the depths to which a human spirit could be forced when the thin veneer of civilization is stripped away by hunger and isolation. The survivor descended the hill, resolute in his determination to share this tale. He understood that their story was more than just a recounting of a catastrophic event. It was a moral parable, an enduring lesson on the human condition and the fragile balance between order and chaos. The legend of the Wendigo, a specter born of humanity's darkest moments, would serve as a stark reminder to future generations of the dangers of unchecked desperation and the importance of community in the face of unspeakable adversity. And as he rejoined his fellow survivors, now working together to cultivate small gardens and gather water from thawing streams, he felt within him a quiet hope, a promise that even in the aftermath of deep horror, there could be rebirth and healing. In the twilight of that long, arduous journey, the community vowed to commemorate the lost and to honor the lessons engraved in their souls by that cursed winter. They established a memorial near the heart of the village, a simple stone marker, worn smooth by time and the elements, inscribed with a single, solemn phrase: "Remember the winter. Honor the lost." It was a tangible symbol of their shared suffering and the resilience that had allowed them to survive the unthinkable. In the years that followed, as the scars of that winter slowly faded, the tale of the Wendigo transformed into a legend within the community, a cautionary story told around fires and during the long winter nights, ensuring that the dark chapter of their past would never be forgotten. Thus, the legacy of that cursed winter became a part of the very fabric of their existence, a reminder that even as nature offers its harsh beauty and relentless challenges, the human spirit, when united by compassion and tempered by shared hardship, can rise above even the deepest horrors. And in that enduring spirit, the survivors found the strength to rebuild, to transform their pain into wisdom, and to carry forward the lesson that while the shadows of the past may linger, the promise of a new dawn always awaits beyond the horizon.